us have done. I could go on for a lot longer, but we wanted to make sure that we left plenty of time for questions and answers. I want to end with just the statement that CASMII put together. And actually, this was my initiative. And I say that because if I get wiped out in the car wreck on the way home tomorrow, I want somebody to know I did this. Because this statement is now being circulated around the world among anti-war organizations. It's on the website of International Answer that's sponsoring the March 20th demonstrations in the National Assembly in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and occupations. It's on many, many websites. It's even showing up on some oil industry websites on the commentary in the Middle East. I checked last night. But I want to read it and then go into the question and answers. And one of the reasons why I really feel good about it is that within CASMII there's a wide range of opinions about what's currently happening within Iran. There are people who are very strong supporters of the Green Movement and opposing the government, and there are people who support the government and are not so sympathetic to the Green Movement. And yet we were able to come together and unanimously endorse this statement, which I think shows some hope for progress not only in the anti-war movements, but also for the situation within Iran itself. It's called an appeal to anti-war organizations and activists to oppose the increasing threats against Iran. Around the world, anti-war activists are preparing for major protests this spring to oppose the continuing U.S.-led occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, a storm of developments is dramatically increasing tensions between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. In response, the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran is issuing this appeal to the anti-war movements in the United States, United Kingdom, and other countries to raise the demands of no war, no sanctions, no internal interference in Iran. Iran is a country that hasn't attacked a neighbor in more than 200 years. Even when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran after the 1979 revolution, and with support from the West used chemical weapons against both civilians and combatants, the Islamic Republic did not retaliate in kind. And yet the U.S. government claims that Iran represents a serious threat to the Middle East region and the entire world. Without a shred of evidence, the U.S. charges that Iran's program to develop nuclear power for peaceful energy purposes is just a cover to develop nuclear weapons. Never mentioned is the fact that as a signatory to the UN's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran's right to develop nuclear energy is enshrined in international law. Just a few months ago, the UN's International Atomic Energy Chief, Mohammed al-Baradei, the person responsible for monitoring compliance with that treaty, stated that, quote, "Nobody is sitting in Iran today developing nuclear weapons. Tehran doesn't have an ongoing nuclear weapons program. But somehow, everyone in the West is talking about how Iran's nuclear program is the greatest threat to the world," unquote. Instead, warning of world disaster if Iran should succeed in its imaginary goal of obtaining nuclear arms, Washington argues that Iran must be forcefully brought to its knees through a combination of increasingly crippling sanctions, taking advantage of Iran's internal divisions, and preparing for a possible military attack. Consider these recent developments. The U.S. has been pressuring the permanent members of the UN Security Council to impose a fourth and more severe round of sanctions against Iran. The only real holdout has been the People's Republic of China, which in January held the Council's revolving presidency. On February 1st, however, the president's seat passed to France, which is nearly as hostile to Iran's nuclear program as is the U.S. France itself, by the way, relies on nuclear power for 80% of its own energy needs. Security Council's permanent members, including China and Russia, have never been a real barrier for the U.S. Not only has the Council already approved 3 rounds of sanctions against Iran, but the Obama administration is now talking of, quote, bypassing the UN in its latest push for sanctions. While sanctions are often promoted as an alternative to war, the world now knows that the sanctions imposed by the UN against Iraq during the first Persian Gulf War resulted in the deaths of up to 1.5 million Iraqis, a third of them children. Not content with just pressuring the UN, the U.S. is pushing ahead with plans for more of its own unilateral sanctions. Congress is getting close to passing the Dodd-Shelby Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act. Among other provisions, this bipartisan bill would, quote, impose new sanctions on entities involved in exporting certain refined petroleum products to Iran or building Iran's domestic refining capacity, unquote. This provision starkly exposes the real U.S. goal, to economically cripple Iran in an attempt to so complicate life for the Iranian people that they might demand a, quote, regime change. In the past, the U.S. has argued that Iran doesn't need to develop nuclear power because of its vast oil reserves, while conveniently omitting the fact that Iran doesn't have sufficient refinery capacity to meet its energy needs through oil alone. Targeting companies and countries that sell refined petroleum products to Iran or that help Iran develop its own refining capacity shows that the real goal has nothing to do with countering nuclear proliferation. The U.S. even pressures European countries not to provide Iran with the means to develop wind energy. Those who desire hegemony over the oil-rich Middle East can tolerate no independent powers, whether or not they present a threat to any other country. This reality was dramatically demonstrated in 1953 when the CIA toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, for the crime of nationalizing Iran's oil industry. Meanwhile, these threats of new sanctions are being accompanied by a military buildup in the Persian Gulf. I'll skip that part because we went over that in the beginning part of the talk. Finally, Iran's ongoing internal political crisis has apparently led some Western anti-war organizations and activists to be ambivalent about the need to stand against Western aggression against Iran. Regardless of how activists view Iran's internal situation, we must all agree that outside pressure and interference must be opposed. As presidential opposition candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi has put it, we are opposed to any types of sanctions against our nation. This is what living the green path means, unquote. No truly progressive democracy activist in a country targeted by the U.S. would appeal to the U.S. for support. The political positions taken by anti-war activists in the West can become a real factor in strategic decisions made by the U.S. government and its allies. Because of this, we are heartened to see that in the United States, the National Assembly to End the Iraq and Afghanistan Wars and Occupations and the Answer Coalition have added the demand of no war or sanctions against Iran to their flyers, promoting national anti-war protests on March 20th. We call on all other coalitions, organizations, and individual activists to do the same, and to further demand no outside interference in Iran's internal affairs, self-determination for the Iranian people. Regardless of differences in our political analyses and views, these demands should be acceptable to all who struggle for peace, justice, and a better world for all. We have copies of that statement, and we're asking folks if they would endorse those three demands on behalf of your organization: no war, no sanctions, no internal interference in Iran. Pick them up that way.
Thanks very much, Phil. I have copies of the statement for everyone, and I can bring them to the back table. You can just pick up a copy if you like, if you're interested, and bring it back to any organizations that you might be working with. Well, I'd like to thank Phil very much. I appreciate everyone giving their thanks as they did. And I just wanted to say, coming up, we're having question period. There's some announcements I'd want to make a bit later on, and there's other events, and then we're going to get into that. But before we go to question period, I thought I should mention that there are costs associated with this event. We did have to bring Phil up. Phil did try for 11 hours. There's gas costs. We did have to publicize this with posters, make reservations, do room bookings. So we'd appreciate if people could pitch in a little to help us with our costs of the event, just to cover the cost of the event and make things easier.